Welcome to the Enneagram with Chelsea Nicowell. This is a positively deviant culture podcast anchored in the Enneagram. In this episode, we're talking about the paradoxes. Before we really get into it, though, quick reminder for you.
Every episode, I want to remind listeners that this isn't a prescriptive, fixed tool, and that our conversations are designed to work with the material and the ideas in an exploratory way. As long as I've been working with the Enneagram, my knowledge and application continues to evolve. And that's what we're here to do, to keep learning.
And the paradoxes usually end up being our favorite episode because they reveal so much of the truth, the hidden places about each type.
Paradoxes help us see how deeply we get it wrong, in the sense of that we are both way better than we understand ourselves to be, and we're also way worse than we understand ourselves to be. And in combination with that, seeing how the paradoxes are actually an explanation for how we're misusing our strengths and how they're connected to the same thing. It's an important part of understanding each type for me because it's a lot of the secret sauce. It's the places that are most hidden and more poetic.
We end up chuckling a lot in these too because they're so obvious that the inverse is also true that it becomes comical in a sense. And it's good to have some lightheartedness, but there are really deep, really weighty topics that we talk about in this episode.
Our brilliances are less obvious. And so we tend to focus on behaviors, and that is not what the core brilliances are about. And then also, what's less obvious is our misuses and the ways that we're destructive and how connected they are to our brilliance. And once we can see them as a misuse and a misapplication, it's easier to self correct and to go, oh, here's how I am amazing. And when I misuse and misapply the parts of me that are amazing, it becomes incredibly destructive and kind of worse than what I'm realizing it is, and also simultaneously better than what I realize it is. And that's the point of having this section.
And similar to the way that the integration points can be a map for development, the knowledge of the paradoxes and what's happening in the flip side is a similar path towards understanding. And well, launching into type 4, highly self aware, I'm really interested to think about the paradoxes and how the fours may or may not be aware of what's happening for them. So let's get into it.
Yeah, that's actually a good framing. It is interesting. Like, these paradoxes should be, and I think probably a lot of fours are in tune with, as a matter of fact. And so this is a little bit interesting, but then there are many of them. And so I hope to bring something more original for the fours that are listening. That this is kind of my most original contribution, I think, to the framework. Inside that self-awareness, fours are very aware of this, that they are self-absorbed. Like, this is not a new insight for fours. What it comes from is a deep self-awareness, right? Like an ability to have sight, and how when you're overusing that skill and ability, then it goes to, only the self. Probably the least obvious paradox with fours is that fours substitute meaning for being. What this means is that fours can identify meaning more easily and more accurately than anyone else. And they can also create it from nothing, like as they sit at the place of creation, right? And so much of creation is meaningful and beautiful. So much of meaning comes from beauty and creation. Where this goes wrong is because that's so unusual. Most other human beings can't find meaning as easily, or certainly create it as easily. And fours will stop there so that it won't actually become anything other than an expression or a location of some meaning. It won't be assimilated into who they are. What's interesting about fours is they have this enormous self-awareness and understanding of their own humanity. And the paradox is that they cannot become that which they know to be true. It's easy for fours to stop at meaning because most of the world, most all humans are looking for meaning. That's the end. We want meaning. We want purpose, right? And this is, I think, the biggest blind spot of all of humanity is that's not the end. Meaning isn't the end. It's becoming meaning where we are somehow absorbing it into who we are, that we are the meaning, that it's in us, and for stop at just locating and creating meaning and locating and creating beauty instead of becoming it. And I don't want to be so binary here because a part of the process of making and creating is a kind of being, but it's momentary. The invitation to fours is how can fours use their power and their skill that is absolutely otherworldly to not just portal, but to take on the elements and incarnate the elements of all of the places where they go and all of the meaning that they pick up and the beauty that they pick up. How can they actually become those things rather than just being translators and just being portals?
When we talked about artists, whether it's writing a song and music or a painting or any kind of art, the words I'm getting for that is this sort of delivery. So when you think about meaning, they've created something, they're delivering it to the world, and then it stops there instead of becoming their art, really, living art.
Yeah, and I think that what's interesting is that fours can speak that language. They can articulate that that's what is the best. They know this in their mind and even in their heart, but to actually become what they know to be true, and particularly in their relationships and in the world, there's just this gap. What I love finding in the paradoxes for all types is that the places where we're most brilliant are the very places where we hide. And that is very invisible. So, what's fun for me is to help myself and to have others to help me see that we hide behind our own intelligences, right? We hide behind our own brilliances because our brilliances are not normal. They're places that most humans don't have. And so they're perfect places to hide because we can't be caught there. So in this instance, for a four, they're able to create meaning and they have such penetrating sight and they can see what others don't see. And so just them expressing that is so amazing that it will end up becoming performative because not many people can access those points. So, what fours will end up doing is performing their places of brilliance instead of becoming. And we all do this, right? Which is my point. Like, we all do this. We end up performing our brilliances and stopping there rather than assimilating that into who we are, into the cells of our being, to where we no longer have to perform. That's who we are. And we're typically doing both, right? Like we perform and we become at the same time. But the interesting part here is to notice when we're only performing, to notice when we're substituting something easier for something more difficult and challenging. A very interesting place to engage fours is that no one else can see that very clearly in them because most others are in awe by what they're providing the world without knowing that for them, it's not difficult. It's not difficult for them to find meaning. It's not difficult at all for them to create in certain ways. Now, I don't want to diminish the work that fours do because it, in many instances, to actually create art or to create metaphorical art is very difficult and requires a lot of discipline and engagement. But I'm speaking in terms of like levels here comparatively for fours compared to a non-four, this is a place that's fairly easy and therefore a place that is hidden and a place that is misleading others to think they are who they're signaling that they are and they're not really. Fours will find this in their relationship to their family or their partners where they can really speak to and locate the areas that aren't working. But the changes that are necessary to make in order for that relationship to work, they won't make. Well, that's very strange when they're the ones who can identify it so clearly. So, how is that? And this is a human problem, by the way. Like most humans can't activate change or transform or become what we need to become in order to be healthier. That's a human problem. But what's interesting around fours is that they can actually locate this in others and in themselves. And that seems like, whoa, well, if you can do that, that should equal that you can become something different. But what we find is not at all. That doesn't equal becoming anything different. that is a different source of intelligence, and that becoming something or assimilating that or substantiating the knowledge and truth that you know is an entirely different skill and capacity. And so I think it's just particularly interesting in fours compared to all the other types, is because the access and clarity that they have around these kind of inner truths.
The natural accessibility that they have, not only to the inner truths, but to be able to create something from nothing and to create meaning, has us all just in awe. But the reality is that because it's so naturally accessible to them, what's required of them for growth is to reach for something more.
Fours have a big head start, and yet it doesn't result in any actual difference. And that's what's interesting. Another paradox is four's ability to locate what's missing, and what's invisible can become an addiction to longing, can become an addiction to what's missing and what's not there and the loss. And it's just because they're designed to see that. And then that seeing creates a connection to it, which is very important. Fours are the ones that are highlighting and exposing the areas that the rest of us are missing. Like that's their core job, one of them, and yet they can stay there to where they just exist in that longing and loss, and not able to, hold multiple things, all the things, which is ultimately their capacity to hold all the things is there. They're just not holding the joy in equal proportion to the loss and grief. And that is an interesting paradox.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about gifts becoming burdens, and in the movement episode, how other types can help them get out of that and heal and create a plan and a path forward. But there is something really special and really unique about the fact that they're willing to go to these depths of pain in greater degrees than the rest of us. So you can see how that could become a fixation. And it is a very unique place to be. So it also sets them apart from many other types, their willingness to go to that place.
Exactly. And it is a special place. It's a sacred space to be able to sit with pain. And yet, it's also a sacred space to sit with joy. The problem that most humans have is that we're identifying something as joy when it is not. There's a substitution happening, for some happiness or some moment of satisfaction that isn't really deeply joy. And similarly with pain, is that we're substituting an instance of discomfort and pain that isn't the kind of useful pain, the kind of pain that is productive. But you're right, the capacity to sit with pain is so unique and incredibly valuable. It's what grows us unless it doesn't. It can also keep us in a place of atrophy. It can keep us in a place of immobilization. And that is what can happen to fours. They're misusing this ability and this capacity to keep them in a state of non growth versus moving them into a state of growth. Another paradox that I find really interesting is that fours are gifted with the ability to be original. Originality and innovation are two of the most difficult human endeavors. It's very difficult to be original, very difficult to be innovative, and they're not the same thing, even though they involve similar things. So, this quality that fours have to be original ends up being a fixation, and it's an over commitment to being original in a way that keeps them from being original. This is the paradox. Much of what is original is how we can be in the banal, in the typical, in the ordinary, in the boring, how we can be in the places that are not obviously original and yet contain originality. And it is through the areas that we don't expect. And it's through a particular unique vision into all things is where we find originality, not in being committed to originality for the sake of originality. And this is what fours can be susceptible to is an overcommitment to being unique and original and special that actually separates them from being unique, original, and special.
When we think about all the references to art and metaphorical art, there are places that become maybe more obvious where originality is required in music and different mediums of art and even self expression with clothing and jewelry and colors. And those are all The first places that come to mind in terms of where originality can live. Four's opportunity is to bring originality to the less obvious places.
Fours are able to find meaning where there really isn't any from most human perspective. And fours are able to locate it and locate it with authenticity, not something that's made up and that actually isn't there. They're able to locate something true and authentic. This happens too around meaning. Fours have a tendency to overly prioritize meaning, and they're creating meaning everywhere in a way that loses meaning. Because when you're overly committed to making meaning and being original, it becomes insignificant. And this is actually a huge conversation that I have with the fours in my life, is that they're locating and overly expressing meaning everywhere. And for me, because that's happening at such a high rate and everywhere, there is a loss of significance because it's everywhere. There's this interesting place of, yes, there is meaning everywhere to some extent. And yes, fours are locating that. And yet to have it be expressed everywhere and in such a similar way, it becomes ordinary because they're expressing it in the same way. So the expression and the location both have to be original and have their own quality of significance. But what fours do is they can't recognize their own patterns and their own formula. So it ends up being performative in a way that they're not recognizing it as performative or formulaic because they're the ones originating it. And the assumption is that they're original and they're locating something that nobody else is locating, when in fact, they're actually saying something very obvious. They need to find a different way to communicate those things so that there's another layer of depth that can be exposed, something that's more truly original. We all apply our formula across the board, right? Like I am no exception to this. And this is, I think, the invitation of fours at their core. The core brilliance is, how do we maintain our originality and how do we accept certain things that are not original, and that's okay because there's a place that doesn't have to always be expressed to have significance, that there can be significance without an obvious originality. And this is the paradox that's very interesting to me and kind of tricky. This is something that is really, in a way, very intelligent and that requires nuance and pacing and sequencing and a disruption. Language and formula, all of these things have to be disrupted in a way that isn't obvious and isn't all the time. And that's a difficult task, that's a difficult exercise.
This one really hits home for me, and I don't know if it's because I'm recognizing that I have a pattern just like you have a pattern and it has nothing to do with 4, or because there's an integration to 4 or a disintegration to 4 where I overly attribute meaning where there actually is no meaning, and it becomes very predictable, a particular meaning that I might attach to something. And because that desire, that need to attribute meaning to something and add that special lens. I mean, this actually goes back to the very surface term of like the need to be special, the need to bring some kind of originality. And what you're saying is like when that's happening everywhere all the time, it actually disintegrates the unique perspective that it could bring if it was done more consciously and less prescriptively.
Yeah, it's really interesting and exactly what you said, Chelsea. I think for you as a two, it probably is very connected to four. Like I said, we're all engaging a formula. And in a way, each operating system is a code. We are coded with a formula, right? And the point of the Enneagram isn't to double down on our formula. The point is to integrate to all nine types so that we are actually indeed less formulaic and more original because there's multiples of code and multiples of language that we're mixing up all the time. And yet consistency is good, right? So there's no one thing that is inherently good or bad or better or worse, right? It's just if we're overusing or underusing, and how can we be reinventing ourselves, which is really the place of a 3 and a 4? How can we engage originality and creativity and reinvention so that we remain fresh and authentic instead of performative, either consciously or less consciously? So, how can we learn to be more than our patterns? Not that our patterns are always bad. Recognize the patterns that are healthy and good and useful and the ones that are not. And then the ones that are neutral that just can be mixed up. It's a complicated matrix of material that we're working with in terms of the external material of the world and circumstances and each other, and our own material, the material of us internally. And I think that this is really a perfect place to have this discussion is inside, the place of a four is what is original? What is meaningful? How do we find it? Where does it exist? When is it important? When is it not? And where can it just exist without even being seen? I think this does solidly exist in the paradox of a four.
What else? What other paradoxes exist?
Four's ability to understand the human landscape and emotional landscape so acutely and accurately, overuse or misuse becomes emotional manipulation. Fours are very good at manipulating others emotionally if they want to, because they just have this access to information. So that's a paradox, right? Like, oh, it's so interesting. It can be used for others or against others. And then their concentration and ability of being archaeologists and digging into the history and kind of rehearsing history in order to know the now, they can get stuck there and then cannot escape from the past. Instead of using the history to create something new or to work with the history in order to heal and resolve, which would be the place of the one or two, it can be stuck in the past and not able to dream of the future.
As always, amazing to dig into what's happening in the inner world. I also noticed a lot of the four in me as we were talking about these paradoxes. And so it's incredibly interesting to find where these things live within us, as it's not as simple as you're a single type, right? It's just being aware of how the overuse can become the misuse and become destructive.
This is exactly why we engage this process of locating the movements and the paradoxes and all these different places of the other types is so that we can see ourselves more clearly and how we move. So it's perfect, Chelsea, that you saw yourself, moving to four. And that is the point of the discussion, is to see how much more expansive we are as humans when we're really integrated and when we're disintegrated, and how the framework is dynamic and it's not so fixed.
Yeah, we'll be continuing this conversation at a future date to explore more of the type 4. In the meantime, make sure to follow and like so you'll get notifications about future episodes. And if you're interested in working with us, you can find our LinkedIn in the show notes.